This is a new section, and I'm going to call this section, I'm going to do an introduction to podcast over the next few days, which I've titled Avoiding Conflict and Being Blessed. And today we're just going to cover the first 4 chapters of Genesis 13. Now, by way of introduction, when preparing this, I was reminded of a period where I experienced some conflict in my life. It was during my first independent holiday as a 17-year-old. Along with a friend of mine called Stephen, we hired a small static caravan in a place called Portrush, which is a little tiny seaside town on the north coast of the north of Ireland. And I went off with him. We each went off on our motorbikes. I had a little 100cc motorbike at the time, and we headed off for what turned out to be a rain-soaked weekend in the town of Portrush. Now, because of the weather, we were stuck in a great deal, and we obviously got a little bit bored. But we had our radios with us, and our tape decks as they were in those days, and we brought a travel set. So we decided that when the forecast said there was going to be rain for a couple of days, so we'd have a mini chess tournament. But right from the off, we argued about the conditions in which we should play the chess game matches. His rule that loud music could be played during the matches. I said I wanted the rule to be no background music so that we could concentrate on the chess. In the end, Stephen unilaterally decided that he would stick to his rule during the games, and I could stick to my rule if I wanted. Well, you can see how that worked out. And that was just one of many sources of conflict we had that week. But overall, we didn't fall out big time. But in all honesty, it wasn't particularly happily holiday because we were both only 17, I think he was 18 at the time, and both quite immature really, and neither of us never really wanted to cede ground, neither of us wanted to compromise on anything. It seemed we just disagreed on a lot that week, and it was a rather unpleasant week at times, full of bickering and quarrelling. Now, the question this morning is, how can we avoid, or better still, how can we prevent conflict in our life? Not just minor conflicts like this, but serious conflict over serious issues. Now, if I could show you a way that the Bible teaches us very directly how you can reduce conflict in your life, but not only that, but how you could be blessed through times of hardship, would that be worth discovering? Well, that's what I'm going to try and do over these next few days. The story and the events we're going to look at over the next, I would say, 3-4 podcasts are played out for us, and they're really going to help us in that. And the opening verses of the part of this chapter will introduce us to the people and the conflict that is going to be played out for us here. So I'd like to begin by reading for you the first few verses of Genesis, which says this, beginning at chapter 13, verse 1. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot was with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. So these first few verses, they're telling us a couple of facts, aren't they? They're telling us that now Abraham is rich, both in livestock and in silver and gold. And he is returning to this place called Bethel, where he had previously, where he had previously built an altar, which is described for us back in chapter 5. And it draws attention to the fact that Lot is still with him. Now, you may recall that God told Abraham to leave Haran and to leave his family behind. But Lot had gone with him up this point. He'd gone with him to Haran. Now, the fact that Lot went with him is an indication that Abraham wasn't totally obeying the Lord at this point. The other obvious thing is the fact that Abram is now rich not only in livestock, but also it's declared he's rich in silver and gold. Now, that would have been unusual for a nomad, a herdsman, to have wealth not just in livestock, but also in silver and gold. And the fact that he returns to Bethel, where he had previously built an altar, is an indication many recognize as Abram returning in his relationship to the Lord. So these verses are telling us that Abraham, after his what can only be described as a failure in Egypt, is returning to Bethel, where he had previously worshipped and called upon the name of the Lord. And in a sense, it means that he's found his way back to the Lord again, or he's certainly heading in that direction, isn't he? Now, many preachers over the years have used this passage to teach us a lesson about wandering away from the Lord and coming back to the Lord. And that's a good message. There's a good lesson to be learned right there about that. And many people have preached on this passage over the year, and you'll find in the internet, if you search for sermons on this subject, some of them will be entitled Back to Bethel. It's a good message that people have found and found helpful over the years, talking about getting back to Bethel, getting back to the Lord. You've departed from the Lord, but you'll need to get back to Bethel, as some will say. So if you, in a spiritual sense, have wandered far from the Lord, if you in your life, in a spiritual sense, have gone down to Egypt, gone into areas of conflict, gone into places you shouldn't, done things that you shouldn't, got into trouble, well, you too need to come back to Bethel today. So there's a good message right there to be learned, and don't miss that message if it applies to you today. But here we go. At this point, we find Abraham back in Bethel, and the place where he had previously built an altar and worshipped the Lord, and he's back there. And remember, Abraham had not been totally obedient in allowing Lot to tag along. Now, the next verses will introduce us to the other character in this little narrative play that we're going to be looking at in chapter 13.
We're really picking up the narrative exactly where we left it last time in the story of Abraham Lot. And this time we're going to look at the source of the conflict that lies between them. And that's covering the point at which we closed off last time, Genesis 13, verses 5 to 7. And I'll just read to you that text again so we can pick up straight away. So picking up at verse 5, it says this. Now Lot was moving about with Abraham, and also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they were staying together. For their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in that land at this time. Now, reading the earlier part of the passage alongside this, you can't help but notice that we were told back in verse 2 that Abraham was rich and had herds and livestock and tents and silver and gold. So Lot is declared to be rich in herds and livestock and tents. So Lot is quite rich, but not as rich as Abraham. Abraham had possessions, but in spite of his mistakes, his possessions didn't seem to have the same hold in them as Lot and his did. Some have summarized this as saying Abraham was rich and spiritual, but Lot was rich and carnal. And this is what sets up a quarrel between them, which we see played out here in verses 6 and 7. Now, I've met people in my work life, and I've been in situations where I thought, this company or this organization or this office isn't big enough for these two people to work together or work alongside each other. I wonder if that attitude sometimes prevails in our local churches as well. Well, anyway, in the case of Abraham and Lot, it manifests itself by them saying that there's not enough pasture to feed both flocks and herds of both men. They both had such large herds that the land was not able to sustain both groups of livestock. So what we have here is the fact that the increase in wealth is that which is beginning to cause strife between them. In a time when riches were measured in herds and flocks, they're really arguing about the potential for the future accumulation of wealth. Verse 7 says that there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. So let me ask you a simple question. Looking at this situation, who do you think should have won this argument? Let me ask you another way. Who had the right to be in this land? You'll remember that God gave it to Abraham, so that should have really settled the matter right away, shouldn't it? Abraham should have said, I'm the owner of this land, God gave it to me, and I will make the choice here. But that's not what he did. What's going on here is as old as the Old Testament itself, but there are lessons to be learned today because it's as recent as today's newspaper. You cannot pick up a newspaper or go searching online or watch the news without reading about some sort of quarreling or conflict or strife between people. It's all over the place, all of the time. You can't listen to the news without it being focusing on some kind of story about conflict. So the question is, what should we as Christians do to address this sort of problem, this potential for conflict when it faces up? Well, I'd like to suggest that in the next part of the passage will tell us very clearly how we can resolve this, how we can face off conflicts at the very beginning when they arise. And it will start in verses 8 through to verse 13, and you may be surprised at God's plan and God's way of resolving conflict. So I'd just like to begin by reading the text for you, and this is Genesis chapter 13 beginning at verse 8, which says this. So Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So this is an important point in the scripture, and there's some signals here, some motives being presented that are going to play out over the next 4 or 5 chapters. So I've said the single word that summarized where we're up to so far, these opening 7 verses of chapter 13, is the word conflict. But now we're at the point where we're going to be talking about separation. The way they solve their particular problem, the problem that exists between Lot and Abraham and their herdspeople, of course, is they're going to simply separate from each other. But really important to take note of the fact is the fact that Abraham says to Lot, you choose. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left, he says, and if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. I'm going to give you the first choice. Now, it's really important we understand how significant that position is. It is a perfect example of someone giving up their rights. Remember, Lot shouldn't have been there in the first place. He shouldn't have even come along with Abram. However, Abraham appears willing to give all his rights up, his first land, in order to prevent strife from increasing, to prevent future conflict. What Lot then does is described in a series of verbs. First it says he saw. He lifted up his eyes and he saw, it says. He surveys the land and he says, well, this is an easy choice for me because the land over there is the one that's really good for grazing herds of flocks of cattle and sheep. Doesn't matter. He doesn't seem to consider that it's close to Sodom and Gomorrah and the potential for problems that lie there, because we know that that's a city with some really terrible social problems. Somebody once said that who you are determines what you see, and what you see will determine what you do. And what he saw and what Lot saw on this situation was very selfish, because he only saw and recognized what he thought was best for him. Verse 10 says he saw, and then verse 11 says he chose. And then verse 12 says he dwelt there. So he saw, he chose, and he dwelt there. And that summarizes what he did. You see, Lot chose what was best for him. He chose what was most desirable to the eye, and he chose selfishly. So if nothing else, this should teach us not to choose by what appeals to the eye, but rather try and discern and trust on what we believe the Lord thinks is best for us. Don't operate on the desires of the flesh, as it would say in other scriptures, the lust of the eye, as scripture calls it elsewhere. Rather, we are called to try and operate on spiritual principles, not to be driven by these earthly drives. Someone once said in an old commentary I read, which I thought was a neat turn of phrase, Lot did not ask himself, is this a good place to raise a family? He merely asked, is this a good place to raise cattle? And thereby he saw an opportunity to increase his wealth. It's important to note that it not only said he pitched his tent near Sodom, it actually says he pitched his tent facing Sodom. That will become relevant and important later on. So I asked at the beginning of this section a few days ago, the thing I laid out was, how will this help us solve conflict? Better still, how will this enable us to avoid conflict? Well, I believe the answer is very clear in this text. Here's the answer, is we've simply got to do what Abraham does and give up our rights, surrender our rights. If you want to solve strife, if you want to end conflict, then be prepared to give up your rights. Now, I believe that is a biblical principle. This is not just a one-off story. It's not just a one-off illustration. It's at the heart of the biblical message of who we are to be and how we are to be. There's a chapter in 1 Corinthians, chapter 6 in fact, when Paul writes to that church and rebukes people in that church specifically because there are disputes going on between people, and to solve it they're trying to take each other to court. And Paul gets very upset about this, and he says to the people in the church that they should solve this problem for themselves, and he gives them a way in which he says he can help them solve that problem. You don't need to go to court, he says. Just pick some spiritually minded people in the church and let them decide what happens. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 6 verses 7 and 8, he says this: the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not be cheated, instead of which you cheat yourselves and you do wrong by doing this to your brothers and sisters? Now, I think there are situations where, as much as possible, in most situations, as believers and followers of the Logos, the Word, we should, as much as possible, always try and establish peace. We should always choose the path of reconciliation. But sometimes that will mean that you simply have to separate in order to move on with the Lord. You have to say, I need to take myself out of this situation of conflict. And to do that, you must always be willing to give up your rights. If everybody was willing to do that, then within believer communities, there would no longer be reasons to fight about things. It's always, always, always better to separate than it is to sit on the sidelines and criticize, or worse still, let a bitter vine take root in your heart. Now, I suspect that some of you listening to this don't feel totally happy about it. That's a problem, you might think. I'm not happy about this. Because you may be thinking, you know what, if I do that, I'm going to lose out. And that doesn't seem a very appealing solution. Well, some more advice is going to come to help us. We're going to tell us how we can live with the consequences of giving something up for the sake of God. Now, you remember the last time that we spoke, I spoke about what are the consequences and how do we live with the consequences of giving something up for God. So we're going to pick up the text in verses 14, and I'll read through to verse 18, which says this: the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, that your offspring could also be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land I am giving to you. So Abraham went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tent there and built an altar to the Lord. Well, we see that the next thing that happens is that the Lord here is rewarding Abram for his act of trust that he's just done by allowing Lot to take some of the land. When he says to Abraham, I'm going to give you all you can see, you see, he had just given up his right, but now God's coming to him to say, I'm going to bless you beyond what I first promised you. I'm going to give you everything that you can see, to the north and the south, and to the east and the west. Go and take it all, he says. I'm giving it all to you. But he also says, I'm going to give this land to your descendants also. You're going to have it, and your descendants are going to have it as well. And your descendants are going to be so many that they will be beyond counting. So after giving to Lot part of what he thought God had given to him, the Lord now steps in and says, I'm going to give you even more than you've given up, Abraham. So the question is, what should we give up in order to get to where the Lord wants us to be? What do we need to surrender to receive what the Lord wants to give to us? And that, friends, I believe is actually the main point of this passage. You see, there are two issues in this passage to take note of. It's easy to read this passage and simply see quarreling and separation and all of that stuff. And this passage, of course, is definitely talking about that. But the primary point of this passage is the promise of the land to Abram. It's mentioned count them, 7 times in this chapter. God promises Abraham the land, and Abraham is willing to trust the Lord that he's going to give it to him. He's going to make good on his promises. And Abraham has learned by this point to say, you know what, I'm just going to trust the Lord no matter how things look and how they might appear to be working out. Whatever the future holds, if it's in the hand of God, that's okay with me. So when Abraham trusted the Lord and unselfishly allowed Lot to make the decision, he on the surface appeared to give up his rights to that land, but that turned out not to be the case, because God comes back and enlarges the promise of the land to him. Which tells me this, friends, you cannot outgive God. The contrast between Lot and Abraham is there for everyone to see. You see, Lot, he chose by sight, and he chose what was selfish, what he believed would deliver the greatest opportunity, the greatest chance of him increasing his wealth. But Abraham chose by faith, and he chose spiritually. And by doing so, Abraham not only avoided the conflict that was rising up between him and Lot, and between his family and Lot's family and the people they employed, but he inherits this great blessing. So here's the bottom line for us. Don't ever make winning a quarrel your goal. Focus on what is loving and what is right, and God will bless you beyond anything that you feel you're having to give up in the moment by going that way and making those choices. It's worth it for the peace of mind, if nothing else, friends. Abraham, by giving up his rights, acted generously. He acted righteously, and he acted mercifully. And in doing so, he resolved a dispute. You see, God has given us freedom, but one of the freedoms that we are able to take advantage of is the freedom to always be gracious, to always put the other first. We have the freedom to be generous, even to the point of surrendering our rights. We can choose to live by grace in the knowledge that God in turn will be gracious to us. But you know what? The greatest example of giving up one's rights is that of Jesus himself, God's only Son. He gave up his right to have a home. He actually he said that the birds have nests and the foxes have dens, but I don't have a place to lay my head. He also gave up his right for money. Did you notice he had to borrow a coin from someone just to make an illustration about the kingdom of God? And he gave up all rights to his reputation, to the point where the Son of God was called a devil by the religious experts of his time. But Jesus went even further than that. He gave up the right to life himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And why did he do that? For what purpose? So that God might exalt him, and that his name would be above every other name, and before him every knee should bow. But there's another reason. Jesus did all that, but there's one more reason. He did it in order to show us how to live our lives. He was showing us how to defeat the power of evil, and by being generous, we would bring people back to God. Jesus was showing us that the only way to win for ourselves, but more importantly, to win others for God, was to sacrifice ourselves, to sacrifice our rights and our comforts and submit them to the will of God. Jesus wants us all to follow him, but we do that fundamentally by losing ourselves. And ironically, by doing that, we can gain the whole world. Only by taking Jesus' example into every part of our lives are we really able to win in this race called life. Jesus himself spelled it out for us in Mark chapter 8, and I'll close by reading this short couple of verses for you, verses 34 and 35. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. I'll close it there, and God willing, I'll see you all back here tomorrow. Bye for now.